to us that Black folks have been senselessly murdered and abused by the very systems in this country that we are told are here to protect us. Today, we are going to discuss these broken systems in hopes to continue to work towards liberation within our community. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Rashard Brooks, and Ahmaud Arbery are several lives that were taken this year. Several lives whose photos on social media were followed by hashtags, hashtag rest in peace, hashtag say her name, and hashtag Black Lives Matter. Today, we're going to talk about justice instead of reaction and injustice, and our panelists have been asked to discuss systemic racism, identity, current events, and anti-racist work happening today. I want to thank all of the panelists for being with us and taking the time to explore these extremely important topics, and I want to thank Anna, our moderator, and I'm going to pass it over to Anna.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Brown. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I will be moderating this amazing panel that we have with us, and without further ado, I would like to turn it over to the panelists. I'm going to ask you to state your name and your background a little bit, any information that you'd like to give, your areas of study, and why you chose to participate in this panel. So I'll start with Denisha.
Hi, everybody. My name is Denisha Haygood. I'm a fourth year here at Bowling Green State University. I'm majoring in chemistry with a specialization in biochemistry. And I wanted to join this panel today because all these events happening have made me want to start speaking up and making a change within my community.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Nicole Jackson.
I'm Dr. Nicole Jackson. I'm an associate professor in the history department, and my research looks at post-World War II Black social activism in the US, the Caribbean, and the UK. And I participated in this conversation primarily because I want to know what kinds of conversations are happening on BGSU. I was gone last year, but I know that the conversation in years before has been lacking, is the word I'll use today. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Tom Edge.
Hi, I'm Tom Edge. I'm an associate teaching professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies here at BGSU. Also the director of undergraduate studies for the School of Cultural Critical Studies. I specialize academically in the African American experience broadly. My doctorate is in African American studies. Most of the classes I teach deal with African American history and culture. And I think because of that, I felt particularly to be on this particular panel. I also want to be careful in being on panels like this that people watching don't always have to hear this message from a white person. They should take it seriously when this message is coming from a Black speaker or from another person of color. At the same time, we should, I think, as white people, take the responsibility and be part of these conversations and contribute to them, and especially those conversations going on with other people.
Thank you. And next, Tiffany Henderson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiffany Henderson. I am an alumna of BGSU. I graduated in 2006. I'm currently a labor and employment attorney at Zash & Rich here in Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm participating in this panel just because these are very important conversations that we need to have. But more importantly, I want us to actually take action and do the work that it's going to take to really transform this country. And to do that, you really have to be engaged and be a part of these very crucial and critical conversations. And so that was why I chose to participate here today.
Thank you. And again, thank you for participating. The next question that we have is, would you please assist the viewers in understanding the difference between systemic racism and individualized racism, and how do they impact people differently? And anyone can jump in at any point.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start. The biggest difference, or the way that I typically explain the difference between the two, is when you're dealing with systemic racism, you're dealing with the actual system, or the structure or the resources, versus individualized racism, where that's more of the idea that a particular race is superior to another. And so that's generally how we look at the difference between the two. Systemic racism is created to create and maintain disparities between people of color. And these disparities create gaps in wealth. They're present in, housing, healthcare, employment, or education. They're present in pretty much every structure of society that we have, even the criminal justice system. And so a lot of times people may not necessarily even realize that systemic racism is at play because it's part of an actual structure, whereas individualized racism is more, person to person, or, someone thinks that they're more superior to another, or something like that. And so I think that typically a lot of people, might experience individualized racism, or may be more familiar with it, I'll say, just because they may experience it more directly, as opposed to realizing that they can also be affected by systemic racism as well.
From an ethnic studies perspective, in some ways, we would say that the term systemic racism is kind of redundant, that when we talk about racism, period, we are automatically talking about systems of privilege and oppression that are linked to race. I completely agree with Tiffany. I'm glad that she brought it back to access to resources, to the tangible impact that this has on people's lives, because I think too often we move away from that and we dwell so much on what an individual person thinks or what's in their heart, and we kind of get away from the systemic inequality that's at the root of any discussion of racism. So from my perspective, and I think from an ethnic studies perspective, if we talk about individual racism, it's more of how individual people's actions and ideas are reflective of that larger racist system. And I think we have to make that clearer whenever we're having a discussion about racism, so that it doesn't just become, how do we change one individual person's way of thinking? How do we change one individual person's actions? And we're thinking of the much larger scale that needs to be tackled here.
Thank you both. Considering your identities and your roles at Bgsu or part of the Bgsu or Bowling Green communities, how have the recent murders impacted your worldview?
I guess I'll start this one. I would say it's impacted my worldview ambivalently. Everything first started happening, I had like a negative reaction towards it. I started being hyper aware of my surroundings and really
Just know that she has frozen.
Yeah, I think we have some connectivity issues, and while she works to address those, would someone else go ahead and address the question, please?
I think from the standpoint, one is a Black woman and two is a Black women's historian. I think it is. The present isn't as important to me as a sort of longer history, right? So Ferguson happened during my tenure here, right? I study social movements of the 1970s and 1980s, right? I'm from California, so I remember what happens in Watts, right? I think for me personally, the sort of present moment is less significant in the sense that it is part of a larger frame. And I think of those things, I think about living in a place like BG where it is primarily white, especially when our students leave, and what it means for our students of color to walk into a place that is primarily white and sees them as temporary and interlopers. I think of what it means that at the beginning of the Trump administration, our sheriff was essentially saying on a panel on our university that his constituency were those primarily white long-term residents. I think of what it means to have an administration that talks about supporting Black student efforts to combat racism on campus and says some version of the same thing every other year. So the recent murders are, for me, part of a larger framework at BG and also globally of people trying to find the right words, but rarely ever trying to find the right actions.
And Denisha is working to address her connectivity issues. I got a message from her. So I don't know if anybody else on the panel has anything to add to that particular question.
I'll add something briefly. I echo Dr. Jackson's remarks, but also I think one of the things that I think about is ultimately, as a country, we haven't come as far as we like to think that we have. And that is, a very real perspective that I think people of color, have. I live in a primarily white and historically white, neighborhood. And, when I tell people where I live, especially to people of color, one of the first questions that I get is, Black people live there, or, historically Black people didn't live there, or, how are things there now? And it's because we know what the history of this city was, as well as the history of this country. And so, I like to think that I definitely have, more advantages than my parents did, or even my grandmother's generation and beyond. But even still, the recent events, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, it just really drives home the point that we haven't come as far as we think that we have. And that, yes, we need to have conversations, but again, these really cannot be just surface level conversations. And we really have to take the time to put in the work and, really change hearts and minds, because we can actually do that and do that effectively. We can have conversations and talk about it all day. And then we're still going to be in the same place that we are now, 50 years from now, which I don't want that to be the case.
And I think Denisha got her connection back. So did you want to finish your comments, Denisha?
Yeah, yes, please. What I was just saying was that the events that have happened have really like shaped the way I think of the world and how I interpret it. And it's made me realize that I need to start speaking out more. I need to start getting involved and trying to make a difference and trying to make a change. It's just what I was saying.
Okay, thank you all very much. In 2020, there's been some controversy around monuments being removed and the monuments and statues that represent historical figures who were overtly racist or covertly so. And we want the panel to address for a moment the importance of recognizing and claiming the history of the United States from our perspectives and sharing that with the community. So would anybody be willing to address that for a moment, please?
Sure, I'll jump in. Well, to begin with, I think a lot of this goes back to some of the points Dr. Jackson was raising earlier as a historian that relate to our lack of an adequate discussion of the history of race and a lack of historical understanding of how different generations have reacted to Black people asserting their basic humanity and their basic rights. Some of the current disagreements over, for example, certain monuments often overlook that these monuments were typically erected during periods of quite not just quite overt racism, but in which certain systems of racism were being created, and this was going right hand in hand with that process. That this was the ideological component to it. That at the same time that we're creating Jim Crow laws, we're also creating Confederate monuments, and some of which would say right there that they were celebrating aspects of white supremacy. So it's not as if in the time period that these were being created that there was really any disagreement or misunderstanding over the meaning of these monuments. It's that as we've gotten further away, we've tried to avoid overtly discussing how these were meant to foster white supremacy. I think you couple that with a lack of understanding of, say, the issues that lead to the Civil War, how systemic racism was sustained after slavery and advanced after slavery. How these images were then used to oppose the civil rights and Black Power movements. You have a lack of understanding about that, and it's very easy to say, well, I don't understand what all of this is about. Of course, the flip side to that is that plenty of Black scholars have put that information out there for generations, and that there were plenty of Black voices in the time these monuments were being erected who said, this is wrong, this is blatantly white supremacist, why are we doing this? So again, I think it's more a case of white people failing to engage that history that's already been written, that is out there for their consumption, rather than any kind of innocence on their part.
I think I'd like to echo that again from the standpoint of a historian. I think people put an incredible amount of energy into the idea that we need to have monuments celebrating great people. We do not. I don't think there is any requirement. There is no historical requirement. There's no social requirement. All of those structures they serve a social and political purpose, right? So the question is, what social and political purpose do they serve? As Tom said, right, they are very often serving the purpose of rewriting the recent history of slavery, right? So I think it is significant that we have absolutely no monument to the enslaved people who died during slavery, right? We have none, and yet we have hundreds of monuments to Confederates who were technically anti-American, who left the Union, and who did not want to uphold the very basic, right, sort of reality of the Constitution, right, of unity. So I think we are sort of making, or there are a number of people who have been making for years this argument that to tear down those monuments is to tear down history, without acknowledging that those monuments have allowed people to ignore history, right? But more significantly, we don't have monuments to, we have very few monuments to great American women, right? So we don't sort of have a problem here of thinking about, or we don't see sort of people imagining that these monuments are representative. We know that they are not. And yet we continue to place an amount of faith in them that is unwarranted and ahistorical, but also in and of itself, a presentation of history that is not true, right? So I think there is this sort of, and this conversation came up 2 years ago or however long it was, and sort of the conversation about the theater, right? This is historical. Again, it is a history that was made but also history can be unmade, right? In terms of a you can take it down. That is historical in and of itself, and that leads to a different conversation. And yet, all of the conversation about preserving history, we are not thinking about the historical narratives that are emerging around these documents or around these monuments at the time and also now.
Thank you. So as we have conversations around racial justice and around equity, how do you infuse that into your work and into your daily lives, regardless of whether you're a faculty member, staff member, community member, or student?
Well, for me, just being a labor and employment attorney, you just want to make sure that you are giving great advice, right? That you're making sure people understand, the effects of discriminatory practices, programming, things of that nature, policies. And so I do my best to counsel my clients to ensure that, they're not intentionally discriminating, obviously, but even just to make sure that policies or programming or actions that they're taking are not still indirectly discriminating against people or disenfranchising minorities. So I think that my work, although I'm not at the Bgsu community, I'm here in Cleveland, but I think that my work still ties into that. But then I also, historically, I have always been one that likes to volunteer and give back. And I am a part of my law school's board of trustees, the Cleveland Marshall Law Alumni Association. I'm a part of their board of trustees, and on that trustee, I'm a part of their social justice and minority outreach committee. And so we do a lot of work, just reaching out to the local community, whether they're alumni or not, and just having very focused and specific programming, having conversations, tough conversations, creating dialogue, and also just making sure that we're doing our best to make sure that everybody feels included and that we're operating and making sure that we have diverse communities and perspectives and opinions. And so I think that one of the key things for me is just to make sure that we are actually having these conversations, because if we're really going to talk about it and we're going to get real about it, these conversations are going to be comfortable, and they're going to continue to be uncomfortable until we get to a place where we can actually understand that there are systems in place that disenfranchise minorities and people of color, and we can actually talk to people about them and find a way to move forward. And I think, honestly, a lot of that is going to start kind of behind the scenes. It starts with, if you hear somebody make a comment about something, say something to them about it. You know what I mean? And as Tom mentioned earlier, it shouldn't matter if it comes from a white person or a person of color. It should still be taken the same way.
Anyone else have anything to add?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I can wait you out all day, Tom. Go ahead.
I'll just say real quickly, for me, of course, with what I teach, I always try to incorporate what's going on now. What is the connection to history that we're studying and the events that we see unfold in our everyday lives? And I think that's become even more important now. But I think the other thing that's become even more important that I was already is also acknowledging what it means to be a white male who teaches about Black history and Black culture. To openly talk about why is it that people who look like me are overrepresented in faculty across this country, even when we're looking at departments that focus on race and ethnicity. So think that when I talk about that with my students, when I talk about the factors that lead to me being here and why it is that they have a middle-aged white male professor teaching this, I think it also encourages them to maybe start analyzing their own experiences more, I would say, especially for my white students, and to critically analyze why they're here, how they got here, and how the system benefits them in ways that they may not have paid attention to before.
So I think for me, this happens in a few different ways. My cat is just clawing in a bookcase. Cut out. I think I think for me it happens in a few days. I mean, I think we need to sort of understand it like diversity is a sort of broader conversation. So when I'm teaching American history, like I tell my students up front that we're looking at race and ethnicity in America, right? So American history is not from the standpoint of white people, right? So it is important to understand, and nor is American history only about sort of great white men and women, right? So I'm talking about Indigenous people, I'm talking about Asian immigrants, as well as African Americans, which is my area of expertise. For me, that is the fullest, and at least, based on the sort of time restraints of the class, the best sort of way to sort of deal with diversity in history, right, is to understand that no single group owns the narrative of American history. And then I also teach African American or African diaspora history courses where I make a sort of point to sort of point out there that I do not personally care in that context about how white people viewed Black history, right? What I care about is looking at Black history from the standpoint of those who lived it. So if I'm thinking about, for instance, the civil rights movement, I am not particularly invested in the narrative that we have continued to sell since about the late 1970s, that the civil rights movement was about integration. It was not, right? It was about equality and justice. That simple framing of the historical narrative is significant and, in my opinion, more historically accurate. And then I think, as a faculty member, as a tenured faculty member, I think that the things that I can and cannot say in a meeting are very different from those who are untenured, those who are adjuncts, and those who are in some ways more vulnerable. And while it is not particularly comfortable for me to have to be the person who shows up to a meeting and is angry for a variety of reasons and sort of the narratives that the stereotypes that plays into, I do have, as Tiffany said, a level of privilege. And I was trained by historians who believed in using whatever privilege they have to the benefit of their larger community. I would also like to say, though, that there should be a sort of narrative about, for all faculty and staff and students, about the strain of that, right? What does it mean that these are the conversations we have had every year that I've been here and longer? What does it mean that we are losing, when we got here, there was a deficit of Black faculty as compared to the percentage in the Black student body, right? What does it mean that our Black students often feel uncomfortable in BG? What does it mean? Like, what does it cost us, right, that our Black students have to travel to Toledo or Detroit to get various necessary like hair products, or to find a larger Black community so that they do not feel exposed in certain ways? That is a cost. And considering that my actual research is on love and things that make me happy, the fact that I present on this campus, and I feel as if I have to present on this campus as someone who is not happy or who is not joyful, I think we should be having a conversation about the university structures that make that so.
And Nicole, we all have the issue of our pets or our children deciding to act up right as we're trying to get on camera. So I'm feeling your pain right now. Denisha, do you have anything you want to add to that, or are you ready to move into the next part of the conversation?
No, I don't have anything to add. They said it all.
So Nicole's last point kind of flows right into the next question. As we're looking at the BGSU community, are there any policies that you believe the university should look to reform to enhance the inclusivity and belonging for all people? And I understand that that's a pretty loaded question, and y'all need time to think about that a second. While our panelists are thinking and preparing to address that, I would like to remind everyone who is participating in the conversation that the Q&A is open. We're going to be wrapping up questions here in 2 or 3 more questions. And if you have anything you'd like to add or any questions you'd like for us to address, this would be a good time to address that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Given some of the the framing of this panel in terms of current events and especially the murders of Black civilians by police officers, we should take very seriously some of the student activists right now who are asking us to reconsider the use of police officers on campus, and especially in the dormitories. This would I know that this is a very uncomfortable conversation for BG in particular to have, but over the summer, we heard so many stories coming from Black students, Black faculty, Black staff about their experiences with racial profiling and either local or county police. And several students have now been trying to ask, what is our relationship as an institution to local law enforcement, and that if local law enforcement seems resistant to any attempt to change, that perhaps we have to change our relationship to it. So I would keep an eye on some of those movements and encourage people to educate themselves on what is being proposed with that right now.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add in terms of policies that the university should reform?
I'd like to add something. So in recent events with the BGSU employee stuff on his Facebook, I feel as though BGSU should have a policies for its employees and students that
So Denisha, I think we're having some connectivity issues again with yours. And I'm very, very interested in what you have to say. So if we can give it a second to kind of catch back up. I think it just did.
okay, am I? Oh, okay,
I think there we go.
can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Is it good?
Well,
I'm so sorry. Is it still breaking up?
that's okay. I think we're perhaps if you turn off your video for half a second, your audio was working pretty well. So unfortunately, we're still having some of those connectivity issues for Denisha. If someone else would like to jump in, and we'll try and adjust those connectivity issues for her?
I'd absolutely echo Tom's point about BG's relationship with police. I do feel as if there is a sort of idea that that relationship is harmonious and people are not reflecting on their own positions in our campus and off-campus community, which I think would illuminate some of that. But I also would love to see the university stop sort of using diversity as an umbrella, right? There are various constituencies on this community who have, just using the police as an example, different relationships with them, right? Our queer students have a very different relationship with local police than our Black students and our Latinx students, right? And yet that sort of all gets sort of thrown under an umbrella, right? So we can fix this with diversity issues without attending to the different ways in which they are impacted by that relationship. The same with our classes, the same with student orgs, right? There's a conversation to be had about the ways in which different constituencies of students, and again, faculty and staff, different relationships entirely to the university. Faculty, depending on their rank, depending on various other things, different relationships to the university. And yet, in every college, in the university as a whole, that all sort of comes under diversity as a sort of broad metric of planning, right? But there's no way to attend to the very real ways in which some of us feel othered on this campus, some of us are pushed out of this campus under one umbrella. So part of diversity is to understand literally the difference, right? And I think we could be doing, the university could be doing a better job of fully attending to what those actual constituencies, those different constituencies are dealing with.
Thank you. That's a great point. Denisha, were we able to get your audio at least working? Oh, she's still having some connectivity issues. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is move on to the next question, but we will try and circle back. If we cannot get Denisha's connection going, what I will ask her to do is drop in the chat what she was going to say, because I think that it's specifically when it comes to issues around policies that impact students, it's really important for us to have the student voice in that. So Denisha, keep working on your connection, and if you're not able to make it work, please drop your comments in the chat so that everybody can read them. Going on to the next question, we're all familiar with the saying that racism is so American that when you protest racism, people think you're protesting America. And so many times it feels like there's nothing that we can do when we're in this protest moment to combat relative to racism. And so the question is, how can members of the BGSU community and the BGSU community writ large, whether it's alumni, faculty, staff, and students on the Firelands campus, on the BG campus, what can we do to advocate for racial justice? And again, that's a pretty heavy question.
Yeah, so look, I'm professionally a pessimist or a realist, depending on your vantage point. And so I would say a couple of things. Nothing is my first answer, right? Unfortunately. But the other thing I could say is, I mean, and I say nothing because in the context of to advocate for racial justice would mean to take a look at every level, right, of sort of what we are doing, to think about our relationships with corporate partners, to think about our hiring, to think about the environment that we are bringing students into. And I have yet to see a university that wants to do that and then does it, right? So the sort of pessimist in me would say nothing. The realist in me would say if there was a sort of real investment in changing racial or in sort of affecting racial justice on our campus, right? We cannot change the world, right? Whatever we tell students, right? They have to do that when they leave, right? If they are going to sort of affect that, some of that has to be done when they leave. But if we're going to prepare them for that, or if we're going to change the environment of this campus, I would say put your money where your mouth is, right? If we want to change, racial justice in terms of hiring, hire someone to teach implicit bias to our hiring committees, right? If we want to change racial justice on our campus, commit to hiring more faculty of color, right? If we want to change racial justice on our campus, like fund programs that are teaching those classes and not make it based on the sort of metric of return, right? That return could be 10, 15, 20 years later. Do it because you want to, right? Not because it will make you look good in, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, or because CNN will come and do a story on it. Do it because it's the good, right? That's what it's for. So it's either nothing, or it is literally looking at every single relationship and saying, we will put the money, we will put the time, we will put the resources where that where that change can happen, and we will not do so in 2 years we can be the campus that fixed racism, but we'll do it because in 20 years when we're bringing in a class that is more representative, a class of first years that is more representative of our region and our nation as a whole, they don't feel as if they have to go to Detroit to not feel spied upon.
Outstanding. Anybody have something that they would like to add to that?
I would add, if we're looking especially at the larger Bowling Green community, its relationship to these issues and its relationship to the campus, first I would echo what Dr. Jackson already said. I've lived in 5 or 6 different university towns, all of which had these same issues, all of which were shocked when you brought them to their attention. And all of whom also got very defensive when you would bring this up. So, to whites in BG, whether it's BGSU or the larger community, first put that defensiveness on the back burner. Unless you're willing to critically analyze why your first reaction might have been defensive when somebody says this is a racist town or a racist university. If you're in the stage where you're educating yourself, great. Make sure you actually read those books that you bought a few months ago. Instead of just letting them sit there, collect dust, make sure that you're talking to people about them. More importantly, once you've done that reading, once you've educated yourself, find a way to get active, do something with it. Tiffany raised the point earlier about the need to connect this to action. And I think for too many whites, the reaction is, oh, well, then I'm going to create something and I'm going to lead this. And well, okay, maybe Black folks are already doing this and you can supply some of the much needed power to get things done. We don't have enough people supporting these organizations and these efforts that are already Black created and Black led. Maybe you just need to ask, hey, what's a tangible way that I can support what you're doing? Whether it's donation, whether it's volunteering, whether it's connecting what you do to something else that you're already involved in. Look for those ways to actively work in the community and build on what some folks have already started.
Yeah, I echo Dr. Jackson as well as Tom's sentiments. And I'll just add, just really be intentional about your programming, about any actions that you're taking. Just really put thought behind it, because I think oftentimes, especially right now, Black Lives Matter and, the senseless murders of so many people of color, to some degree, for some people, not all, but to some degree, it's kind of become the cool thing to talk about diversity and inclusion. And at the moment, it's like the thing to do. So, we don't want this to be just, something that is a hot topic right now. We need to really figure out ways to truly engage in these tough conversations and truly evoke change, lasting change, stuff that's gonna, reverberate for generations to come, and not something that's just gonna be what's to do at the moment. And I think that it's really important, like Dr. Jackson said, we have to look at all of these systems, every single one of them, from the relationships with the university, faculty, the students, people in the community, whether it's law enforcement or local businesses, what have you. We need to look at all of these relationships, because the reality of it is money talks. And once you start to, get people to say, I'm not supporting this, I'm not donating money to this, I'm not going to stand for this, unfortunately, a lot of the times that's when change starts to happen. And so I think the other important point that Tom brought up is, figure out ways in which you can really be an advocate or an ally, and really figure out how you can become a part of the change, because a lot of times Black people and people of color are the ones leading these conversations. And so, we, it's very hard and very tiring and very draining to be part of a disenfranchised group, and then also have to be the ones on the front lines advocating for equality and equal rights and things of that nature, and sometimes, it's nice to actually have people come to you and say, hey, what do you need? How can I help? What can I do? I think that's full. So just figure out what role you can play in ensuring that, we're taking necessary and intentional steps forward into transforming even BGSU's local community. And then we can maybe look at things on a larger scale after that, but definitely BGSU community first.
Thank you all. I know we got a little bit of a late start, so I'm hopeful that folks will stick around for a few minutes after 12 so that we can continue on. Before we get to the last question, I do want to address some of the Q&A and point everybody to the chat where Denisha dropped in what she was going to say on the previous question about policy. But some of the things that have been posed either in the Q&A or privately in the chat to me were that a comment that diversity should be present at the decision-making level to ensure that all perspectives are included, and making sure that diversity is widespread at the decision-making level and not just one or two voices at the table. Another person said, I do not know Dr. Jackson, but I love her already. So big props to Nicole for that one. And then also just trying to hit on some of the questions that came through in the private chat to me. One of them was, what are some of the long-term consequences if we continue to ignore diversity and inclusion, particularly at BGSU? But I think that that's a question that the nationwide is appropriate. So if y'all would take a second to address that.
So I would say on campus, we are actually at the long-term consequences. If you have been here, if you ask anyone who's been here longer than 5 years, I'm sure they can rattle off a list of faculty of color we've lost. They can tell you about how many staff of color we used to have, right? They can talk to you about the sort of ignoring of not just diversity, but seeing diverse people as integral to our community. They leave. That's what happens, right? They leave because they want to. They're fired. Their contracts aren't renewed. I mean, there are just a sort of many things that happen there. Nationally, it is the same thing. Something that happened sort of really significantly at the end of, so when the civil rights movement sort of ends properly, the Black Power movement says, okay, those laws are great, right? But we need to be dealing with like structure, we need to be dealing with resources, and we need to be dealing with the sort of way that Black people view each other, right? If not, we will end up in the same position we are in now. Well, once you got the VRA, right? Once you've got the Voting Rights Act, you end up in a very similar position that we're in like the early 1950s, where Black people have little access to resources, right? Little access to literally the things they need to vote or voting places nearby, or you have a sort of, you end up like in Atlanta, where a number of the voting places in Atlanta, in Georgia, recently, either did not have working machines or they did not have enough machines, right? And that would have been a thing that the VRA would have tracked, right? And yet we now don't have that. So we don't have any sort of mechanism for holding Georgia accountable for what they did, right? In the same front, right, with the sort of Brown v. Board decision, even though I would argue this is not what Black families wanted, right, in terms of integration, what the point of integration was to equalize resources, right? Instead, you have the gutting of the public school system and the creation of charter schools that are in many places completely unregulated, and producing a kind of education that is, considering the American educational system is not the best globally, is somehow even worse, right? These were things that the Brown v. Board decision was supposed to address. So we are literally living in the aftermath of what happens if you are not vigilant about thinking about diversity and racial justice.
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Nicole. Perspective is everything, and your background lends itself so well to the conversations like this. So I'm really grateful that you're on this panel.
By the way, I'm not happy that these are the comments that I have to make.
Right. But I think that other people need to hear some of the things that you have to say. So one of the comments that was added said, please, for departments to consider reaching out to students of color, to the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the Division of Diversity and Belonging, before creating programs that gear towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. My guess is surrounding that is that we all know those folks who have well-intentioned programs that go horribly awry because they're not considering the proper delivery methods or backgrounds that they need. They're not considering a bunch of different perspectives on that. And so that was not me, and it wasn't even somebody that works in the division, but it was pointed out. And so I did want to make sure that I said that out loud. Before this all wraps up, and this is a direct quote from the messages, before this wraps up, I want to thank all the panelists who volunteer their time and labor today. It was mentioned previously that particularly people of color, but all folks who are part of these movements are doing a lot of emotional labor, are doing a lot of unpaid labor, and this is part of that. And so we want to take a moment to recognize that and to thank you all for taking the time out to share with everyone. A couple of other questions that came in. Where have you as panelists experienced resistance to expanding the approach to diversity and inclusion? And what have you offered or said to those involved to support them as they're trying to make those expansions?
Well, I teach about race and ethnicity for a living, so it begins in the classroom. The resistance to anti-racist teachings, resistance to different frameworks through which we can view both American history and the contemporary American moment. that may come out directly in the classroom, but a lot of it is more likely to come out, say, if I assign a paper and they feel safe sharing this with me because I'm white. You'd be surprised some of the things people will admit to. It's sometimes really shocking to read it, and then you realize, oh wait, I've had this kind of thing before. And over time, I mean, one of the things that develops, I think, from the perspective of a faculty member, then is how do you grade something like this? How do you manage this in your job? And while also, how do you engage this person in a way that, okay, now I have to have this conversation with them. Maybe it's through Canvas, maybe it's directly. It's not easy, but it's necessary. I will say drafts are often involved. First, okay, this is what I would like to say, erase that. Okay, now here's the conversation we're going to have. And here's how I can push back against some of what you're saying here. Sometimes it's as easy as asking them to actually back up what they're saying, because sometimes it may just be rooted in assumption. But it's also, sometimes it takes a really painstaking approach to point by point, breaking down, okay, this is what you said, this is how it comes across, and this is the message you seem to be sending to me, and this is why I take issue with it. Sometimes separating that completely from, okay, have you satisfied what I need for this assignment is a big part of it. But it's, those are the conversations that often take place away from class, that don't get acknowledged, that most people don't ever see.
I would say the place that I find most of that resistance outside of the classroom, I would agree with Tom, is sort of well-meaning diversity committees or well-meaning committees that are meant to be addressing these things, right? I think what we're dealing with, and this is not uncommon, it is not a particularly singular BGSU thing, but I think there is a sort of way in which universities like to pull together those who are willing but who do not have the training. And so what you do in that context, which is kind of also what that comment was talking about, and sort of reaching out to OMA, things like that, right? What you do in the context of people who are willing to volunteer for a committee or who are willing to do like a leadership program, things like that. One, that's self-selecting. So you end up getting a whole bunch of usually sort of white women, right? Which means that the sort of conversation about diversity very often excuse race, realistically, excuse international, the feelings of international community members, right? Because we're talking about usually native-born white women. But it also doesn't sort of deal with sort of how you can be both privileged and marginalized, right? And so that is one singular problem, right? And that's what Tom, I think sort of Tom sort of positioning himself as a white person doing this work is sort of trying to highlight, right, that is a privileged position in a field of study that is not privileged, right? But I think the other thing that happens when you sort of focus on that volunteer work, especially in terms of how universities structure work and service, is that you are asking people who have, again, the best wishes, but do not know how to implement these things in ways that are equitable, in ways that can build long-lasting changes. And usually in those committees, they don't have time, or they don't have the money, the resources to do the things that they want to do.
You are so good at flowing into my next question. My next question was going to be posed in the chat. So what can those who are doing the work but can't allocate the resources, whether it's because of hierarchy or personal means, what can they do? And I suppose the corollary to that is beyond engaging the folks who do have the resources and pleading the case and trying to make things happen.
I'm going to be, I'm going to be really honest here. I think there are people at BGSU who do the absolute best they can on no money, right? Or with very little money, or student orgs who are using every drop of money they have, right, allocated to them to do the work. We are past the time, in my opinion, where that should be happening. If the university wants to prove that they do not support racist messages and hostile environments on this campus, give them the money, right? Put your money where your mouth is. I think this has been the sort of integral issue of American history, right? As I said at the beginning in my introduction, a whole bunch of people who are trying to find the language to prove that they are not racist, to prove that this is a safe space, but are not willing to allocate any of the resources to make this a place that is not racist and a place that could be a safe space. This is where we are.
And my very last question as we roll into 10 minutes past the time we were supposed to stop. And again, for those who have hung around with us, thank you so much for staying and participating in the conversation. And again, to the panelists, thank you so much. Denisha, I know you've had some connectivity issues, and we appreciate you're doing your absolute best to get in there and give us some good feedback and some good ideas. The last question is what would you say to folks who are looking to educate themselves in this anti-racist work? And how can they help friends and family to start to educate themselves as well?
Well, I would say just, take some initiative. We all have access to the library. We have access to Google, social media, the internet. Just take some initiative and take some responsibility. I think one of the things that, bothers me is when, people have all these different resources available to them, put the onus on the disenfranchised to be the ones to educate them about what the problems are or what issues that we're facing. And I think for me that it comes across as being really disingenuous, because if you really want to be an advocate or an ally, you have access to the same resources that I have. You can do a quick Google search or go to the library, get a couple books. There's some basic things or basic steps that you can take to at least show that you're serious about this conversation and about, social justice and equality for everybody else. And so I think just, take some action on your own first. The other thing that you can do is, like I mentioned earlier, ask specifically. I'm sure if you were to, approach Black people or other people of color, and you said, hey, this is not right. I see what's been going on. What do you need from me, or what can I do? I really want to, help change our communities and, make this place better for everyone. So what can I do to help us get one step closer? And I feel like if it comes from that place, more oftentimes than not, people will say, okay, well, this is what I need, or this is what you can do. But I think at the most basic level, you can do your own research. We all have access to it.
I think we also have to think about getting access to this information and these teachings to people before they get to college. And of course, not assume that everybody goes to college and thus has a chance to take a class in ethnic studies or one of Dr. Jackson's classes in history. I get so many education students coming through my classes saying, well, how early can we talk about this with students? And I tell them, well, Carter G. Woodson talked about this in the 1930s, this very question. He said, if Black students are old enough to experience racism, then white students are old enough to learn about racism. So using that as a jumping off point, then I will talk to them tangibly. Okay, well, if you've got K through 5 students, fine. Here are some resources. You can go to your local library and look at these. You can use this as a jumping off point. It's never too early to start that discussion, but I think there are so many parents who probably feel, white parents who feel ill prepared to have this. We not just need to get them involved and get them initiating this in the home, but we also need to create a generation of teachers at all levels who are undertaking this work in the schools. One of the things I think has emerged in this conversation is a lack of common understanding of the history, a lack of understanding about basic terminology when we're talking about racism. And the earlier we get those conversations going, the better.
And to that point, I would like to point everyone to the Division of Diversity and Belonging website, where we have a list of terms that we are using as our common definitions on campus. So when those of us who say diversity, who work at BGSU, this is the framework from which we're coming. When we use the term inclusion, what does that mean? And there are a lot of good resources on that website for the Division of Diversity and Belonging. Once again, thank you all so much for spending time with us. To the panelists, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your labor and your emotional labor. And I am going to turn this back over to Jamie. Thank you all so much for your participation.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you so much again, Dr. Jackson, Tiffany, Dr. Edge, and Denisha. It was really wonderful to have you all here and to answer the question and engage in this dialogue. And I know that, we were already flooded with so many comments, and Anna has explained those as well. But everyone is really grateful for this discussion, and we look forward to continuing this movement and educating our students. And I cannot wait to listen back to this recording to let it all sink in a little bit and stick to my ribs. So thank you all so much, and you are very much appreciated. I appreciate your time, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.